Good morning, everybody. It's great to see so many people here this morning. Well, we are in for a big treat. My job is to introduce my friend and colleague and mentor, Dr. Frank Chaloupka. Frank is a professor of economics and research faculty at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and he directs or has directed the Health Policy Center there. And he's the principal investigator on an $8 million grant from Bloomberg Philanthropies. And yesterday, he explained to me that he was actually transitioning, kind of getting ready for retirement, jealous, and his long-standing projects over the years, he was transitioning and he got a call from Bloomberg, not surprised, to lead this 17-country effort. And the award is really to accelerate the development of effective tobacco tax systems in low and middle-income countries. He told me he has 17 countries that he's working with. Frank, if you know, is an expert in economic analysis of substance abuse and the impact of prices on demand for tobacco, alcohol, and other drugs. And he's really done the sentinel research on impact of prices on saving lives. You saw the slides that Phil put up on measles and saving lives. Well, he is the one around the world, actually, why Bloomberg called you, to look at how tobacco taxes actually save lives. So he has directed and founded the Impact Teen program that many of you may know about. It was a Robert Wood Johnson-funded collaboration for nearly 20 years, I believe, investigating the common threats to teen health, including obesity, substance use, and tobacco use. I was really fortunate to work with Frank from 2000 to 2003. He was my mentor in a Robert Wood Johnson-funded leadership program in substance abuse, and he really taught me firsthand how to be an effective health policy researcher, but also how to pull teams together. I watched him as he was pulling in teams from the World Bank and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the CDC and you name it. Pretty impressive, really, with humility, I might add. He's not only a prolific and brilliant health policy researcher who collaborates seamlessly with many across disciplines in the World Bank and the World Health Organization, and I could go on, but he's an extraordinary mentor. He's had, I'm sure, over 100 health policy students in his career, and plus he's a genuine, kind person. So please join me in welcoming Frank Chaloupka.
Thank you, Ellen. That's quite an introduction. I was fortunate to get to work with Ellen during the mentorship program that she talked about, and I'm not sure who learned more from the other. I feel like I learned a lot from Ellen as a result of our opportunities to collaborate together, particularly the passion that she brings to her work and the dedication she has to it, and it was a great experience. So I was delighted to be invited to be here to share some of the work that I've been doing with you all. Today is the perfect day to talk about what I'm going to talk about. So, as Phil mentioned at the beginning, today's tax day, and I'm going to talk a little bit over the next 40 or 45 minutes about fiscal policy, mainly tax policy, and share with you some of the work that I've been doing for the last 30 years or so in terms of fiscal policy and health. So a few basic things to cover in the next 40 minutes. I'll talk a little bit about non-communicable diseases and the growth of NCDs around the world, but then really get into some of the causes of these diseases and what we can do about it in terms of health policy, specifically around tax policy. I'll talk briefly then about some of the other implications of tax policies, and then get into why we haven't made the progress with these policies as we should have, given all the evidence that's available showing how effective tax increases for tobacco and alcohol are, how effective things like sugary beverage taxes are. And that's because of the big industries on the other side and a lot of the arguments that they put forth about all the bad things that are going to happen if you raise these taxes. So just to briefly cover the health and economic impact of NCDs, at this point, about 40 million deaths every year occur as a result of non-communicable diseases around the world. You can think about cancers and cardiovascular diseases, various respiratory diseases. So a huge cause of deaths globally. And one of the things that's happened over the last few decades is that we've really seen a shift in the burden of NCDs. We've seen this move from high-income countries predominantly to something that's now much more of an issue in low and middle-income countries. So as these economies have developed, as people have become wealthier, what we've seen is they've picked up a lot of the same bad behaviors that contribute to death and disease that we saw typically in the past limited to high-income countries. And when we think about the behaviors that really contribute to NCDs, there are a few common factors that account for most of the deaths that we're looking at around the world. So tobacco use, about 8 million deaths every year. Alcohol use, almost 3 million deaths every year. And now we've seen a big rise in obesity, contributing to about 4.3 million deaths every year. And obesity is really going to be linked to poor diets and physical inactivity. So major risk factors that contribute to these NCDs, to the health problems that we see around the world. And at the same time, we see significant economic consequences as a result of these. We see significant amounts of healthcare spending going to treat the diseases that are caused by NCDs. We see significant lost productivity as a result of the people missing time at work because of these diseases, dying prematurely. And we've started to get some really good evidence showing that these behaviors are also a cause of poverty globally, and that they really contribute to the inequalities, the health inequalities that we see in every country around the world. And just to give you some sense of the context, if we look at the costs associated with the global economic crisis of about a decade ago, we're looking at estimates suggesting that NCD costs will be about 5 times as high over the next 15 years. So talking about $140 trillion in lost economic activity, healthcare spending, and so on that go along with these NCDs. And again, the specific behaviors have substantial costs associated with them. We recently did a review for the U.S. National Cancer Institute and for the WHO, looking at the economic evidence globally around tobacco. One of the things that we saw was that tobacco use costs the global economy about $1.4 trillion in 2012, almost 2% of global GDP. If we see the estimates that are available for alcohol, you see very similar costs, even a little bit higher in the countries that these have been produced for, somewhere between 2 and 2.5% of GDP. And then obesity costs are also going to be substantial, about $2 trillion in 2014. Again, almost 2.5% of GDP at that point. So again, NCD is a huge global burden, not just from a health perspective, but also from an economic perspective, and a few basic behaviors that contribute significantly to these NCDs. So that leads into thinking about what sort of policies we could pursue that would have some impact on these consequences, these health and economic consequences. And the one that I spent most of my life working on is tax policy, fiscal policy, looking at how changes in taxes, changes in prices can really change behaviors in a way that leads to better health outcomes and reductions in economic costs. So I always like to start when I do one of these talks with my all-time favorite quote. How many people know Adam Smith? Well, a few, good. So Adam Smith is an economist. In the 18th century, wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, which is really the foundation for modern economic theory. And in the book, he talks about a variety of different taxes. And here he says, sugar, rum, and tobacco are commodities which are nowhere necessaries of life, which have become objects of almost universal consumption, and which are therefore extremely proper subjects of taxation. So I always like to say almost 250 years ago, he really defined what I would end up spending my life working on. I've done a lot of work around tobacco tax. This is where I started out. Back when I first started working on tobacco taxes, the perception was that people were addicted to tobacco, to nicotine, and you could change taxes, you could change prices, and it really wouldn't have much of an impact on behavior because of their addictions. But what we've learned from hundreds of studies now from every part of the world, countries at all different income levels, is that when you raise tax, when you raise price, you reduce tobacco use. So you can see this in country after country. When prices go up as a result of tax increases, other factors, that leads to reductions in tobacco use. This is a picture from Hungary, but I've drawn this graph for every state in the U.S. for virtually half the countries in the world at this point, and we see the same relationship over and over and over again. We estimate that for every 10% increase in price, we see about a 4% reduction in overall tobacco use in high-income countries, and we see a little bit more of an effect in low and middle-income countries, about 5% on average. We estimate that about half of the impacts of taxes and prices on tobacco use come through reductions in the number of people who smoke. This is illustrated here in a picture from Brazil. Brazil has been very effective at raising its taxes over the last 15 years. As they've raised taxes, they've seen significant reductions in overall tobacco use, but also significant reductions in the prevalence of smoking. Now, most of the reductions that we see in prevalence come because people try to quit smoking in response to those higher taxes and prices. This is a picture from the US just looking at calls to state quit lines. And what you can see, that big spike at the right end there, is what happened the last time that we raised our tax in the US at the national level. So in 2009, the federal tax went up a little bit over 61 cents a pack. And you can see the big increase in smokers' interest in quitting in response to the tax increase. And you can see that that actually starts before the tax even goes into effect. So once people knew the tax increase was coming, people started calling quit lines looking for help to quit. We estimate that for every 10% increase in price, about 10% of smokers are going to try to quit smoking. It is a very addictive behavior. Many are not going to succeed on their first try, but what we do see is that over time, smokers do respond. Smokers do quit successfully in response to these tax increases, and that's illustrated by this picture. So what we're looking at here is state prices across the horizontal axis, largely reflecting differences in state taxes, and then the percentage of ever smokers who have successfully quit smoking. And what we see is that in states where taxes and prices are higher, we have a lot more former smokers, a lot more smokers who have quit smoking in response to those higher taxes and prices. A lot of the work that I've done is focused on kids. We see that kids are particularly responsive to price. We estimate that they're about 2 to 3 times more sensitive to price than adults are. This is something that we've done a lot of work on in the US, but we're starting to see the same sort of evidence emerge globally. This is a picture from Chile where they've been increasing taxes over time. Prices have gone up, and as prices have gone up, we've seen reductions in youth smoking there as well. The other thing that we're learning is that it's not necessarily just price by itself that's important. In countries, some of the countries that we're working in, very rapidly developing economies, incomes are growing quickly. And what we see is that it's really the combination of price and income that's driving behavior there, or what economists are calling affordability, so how price compares to income. So this is a picture from Indonesia. Indonesia saw rapid economic growth. Taxes and prices for cigarettes were not keeping up with the growth in income. Cigarettes were becoming more affordable over time, and that really contributed to significant increases in smoking prevalence there. The Ministry of Finance there caught on, started to understand this, and started to raise taxes at a rate that kept pace with the growth in income. Affordability stopped increasing, and as affordability stopped increasing, we saw the rise in prevalence stop as well. And at the end of the day, all this has a real public health impact. This is a picture from France. France in the 1990s, the government there decided to take on tobacco. One of the first things they did was to start raising taxes and prices. You can see on the blue line, tax went up, price went up. And immediately on the red line, you start to see the reductions in cigarette consumption in France. And then within a couple of years, you start to see some of the health impact of that showing up in terms of reductions in lung cancer deaths among young males. So again, very immediate, very quick impacts on public health. Unfortunately, the French government changed. The new government came in, stopped raising tax and price. You can see on the blue line, flatten out, the drop in consumption stops. And then you start to see, when it comes to that health impact, that also starts to go away as well. So again, a couple of years ago, we did this monograph with NCI and WHO, reviewing all the global evidence. And the main conclusion that we came to was that significant increases in taxes and prices are the single most effective way to reduce tobacco use, and they're also the most cost-effective policy that we have for reducing tobacco use. Very low costs of implementation, generate revenues at the same time. So population-level interventions are going to be highly cost-effective, but of those, tax increases are going to be the most effective and cost-effective. And when it comes to taxes and alcohol use, we see the same sort of evidence from around the world. We have dozens of studies now at this point from high-income countries. We're starting to see studies emerging from low and middle-income countries, and very consistent with what we saw for tobacco. Increases in taxes and prices pretty much affect all aspects of drinking, the frequency of drinking, the prevalence, the intensity of drinking, with the effects a little bit bigger than what we saw for tobacco. Here we're estimating that in high-income countries, a 10% increase in price reduces overall alcohol consumption by between 5 and 8%. Varies a little bit from beverage to beverage. Beer tends to be the least responsive to price. Spirits consumption tends to be the most responsive to price. And in the studies that are emerging for low and middle income countries, we're seeing similar evidence in terms of the price effects there. And very consistent with what we saw for tobacco, we generally see bigger effects among young people. You can see this when you start to just look at some of the data again from around the world. This is a picture from Ukraine, where Ukraine in recent years has started to raise taxes, driving up prices for distilled spirits. And as soon as they start to raise tax, as soon as they start to raise price, you can see the reductions in consumption that come along with that. These are some data from the US where we're looking at state taxes on alcohol, the different types of taxes that are being applied. And what we see is that the states that have higher taxes and prices have lower rates of binge drinking. And we see, again, even bigger effects when it comes to binge drinking among young people. And then economists like me have looked at pretty much every outcome that you could think of that would relate to excessive drinking, and looking at how tax and price affects those sorts of outcomes. So looking at drinking and driving and traffic fatalities as a result of drunk driving accidents, looking at a variety of health conditions, liver cirrhosis, cardiovascular complications, alcohol-related cancers, and so on. Looking at violence that's attributable to alcohol, so things like homicides and suicides and child abuse and spousal abuse. Looking at a variety of other outcomes, accidents in workplaces, teenage pregnancies, sexually transmitted disease rates. And what we see is that in every case, we see a strong relationship between alcohol tax and price and these different consequences of excessive drinking. So higher taxes, higher prices, reduce drinking, but then also reduce all these consequences of drinking as well. So that led us to start looking at how tax and price might contribute to diets and obesity. So when we started to see the rise in obesity a couple of decades ago, we started to think about how we could take the lessons that we'd seen from tobacco and alcohol and use that when it came to diets and to try to reduce obesity. So economists have done a lot of work looking at the impact of prices on consumption of a variety of different healthy and unhealthy products. And not surprisingly, we see that price is a key driver of people's consumption of different products. How much of an effect price has varies from product to product. But you can see some of the estimates there. We estimated, for example, that a 10% increase in price would reduce overall soda consumption by about 8%. If the price increase was limited to sugar-sweetened beverages, we saw about a 12% reduction in consumption. Saw smaller effects when it came to things like fast food and sweets consumption, but also saw some impact of prices on things like fruit and vegetable consumption. And again, if you just look at some of the data from around the world, you can see these relationships pretty clearly. So what I'm doing here is looking at changes in prices for sweet and savory snacks over time and how that's contributed to changes in consumption. And what we see is that as prices have generally gone down in a lot of countries, we've seen increases in consumption. In the countries where prices have gone up, we've seen reductions in consumption. And we're estimating here for every 10% increase in price for snacks, about a 5.5% reduction in consumption. And again, we see the same sort of thing when we look at things like soda consumption, soft drink consumption. Here are the effects: about a 10% increase in price, about an 8% reduction in consumption. So again, we see that there is this clear evidence that these prices affect consumption of healthy and unhealthy foods. And that started to lead us into thinking how changes in prices might contribute to changes in obesity. So I always start by just putting some of the data together. This, I think, is pretty compelling. You look at this. This is looking at adults' prevalence of obesity and looking at what's been happening with fruit and vegetable prices. And we've seen that as fruit and vegetable prices have gone up over time, we've seen increases in obesity associated with that. And on the flip side, as we've seen things like carbonated beverage prices go down, as we've seen fast food prices go down, as we've seen the prices of sweet and salty snacks go down, that's also been associated with this increase in obesity. So what we started to do was to look at how changes in prices contribute to changes in obesity. And what we're seeing is that there is, I think, pretty compelling and growing evidence that shows that changes in the relative prices of healthy and unhealthy products really are driving people's consumption patterns in a way that is contributing to the growth that we've seen in obesity. And it's very similar to what we've seen with tobacco and alcohol. We see that there are generally bigger effects of prices on younger people. We see that there's generally bigger effects on people at lower incomes. And we're seeing the biggest effects in the populations that are most at risk for obesity. So then we start thinking about how we might be able to use fiscal policy, tax policy in particular, to change some of these trends. And where we started was with sugary drink taxes. So the idea here is that there is clear evidence showing that sugary beverage consumption is a causal factor when it comes to obesity, and that there are a variety of other health consequences, things like type 2 diabetes that are associated with sugary beverage consumption, and that it really doesn't have any nutritional value. So this seemed like a good product to start with. If you look at what's been happening globally, you can see that the countries where consumption is the highest are the ones that have the highest rates of obesity. And as consumption comes down, you see lower and lower rates of obesity. The US and Mexico on the left end of the graph are the ones that have some of the highest rates of obesity along with the highest rates of consumption. And then when you just look at what's been happening with prices, we see that these products have become much more affordable over time in virtually every country around the world. So again, looking at how prices have been changing for sugary drinks in different countries by different income levels, the farther below the line you are there, the more affordable products have gotten over time. So this is something that we're seeing across countries at every income level, high income, middle income, low income countries. The only exception there is Japan, which is not because products have gotten a lot more affordable or a lot more expensive there. It's because incomes stopped growing there. We're actually falling for a number of years. So again, when we start to think about what we can do about this, we start to think about how a tax could be used to change the relative prices of healthy and unhealthy beverages. And Mexico is, I think, the best example of this to date. Mexico is the first country to implement a significant sugar-sweetened beverage tax. They put in a tax back in 2012 that was a peso per liter. And on average, what it did was exactly what it was supposed to do. It raised the price of these products by about 10%. That 10% increase in price has had a significant impact on consumption of these products, on sales of these products in Mexico. So what we're looking at there is on the top line what would have happened to consumption given trends, given what was happening with incomes in Mexico, and then looking at what actually happened to consumption. So significant reductions in consumption relative to what they would have been in the absence of the tax and price increases. We've seen significant impacts that differ by income group. So again, very consistent with what we've seen from tobacco and alcohol. Low-income families are the ones that responded the most in terms of cutting back how much they were consuming of these products. And then I think where we have the biggest potential for impact is that it's really the consumers that are consuming the most of these products that respond the most to the changes in prices. So the populations that are most at risk for obesity are the ones that are cutting back their consumption by more in response to the tax and price increases. So a very nice study that was just published looking at how the highest consumers of these products were the ones that reduced their consumption the most. Those who were infrequent, light consumers, reduced their consumption the least. So again, very good evidence on what the impact of these types of taxes and prices is on consumption of the products and on some of the health consequences associated with it. At the same time, these taxes are very, very effective in generating revenues. It seems counterintuitive. If you raise the tax, reduce consumption, you think that that's going to lead to reductions in tax revenues, but the opposite actually happens. Taxes only account for a fraction of price, and typically consumption goes down by less than the increase in price. And we have really good evidence around the world when it comes to tobacco taxes on this. So this is a picture from South Africa. South Africa's government back in the 1990s, again, decided to take on tobacco started to raise their tax incrementally every year. And every year as they raised their tax, they were able to increase the revenues that they were generating from that tax. And we've seen the same thing happen in countries where they've taken a much more aggressive approach. So Ukraine, again, was a country that has significantly increased its taxes, raised its taxes tenfold over the last decade. And as they've done that, despite the big reductions in consumption of tobacco, they've seen about a six-fold increase in revenues. So the same thing is true. I wish I could show you pictures for alcohol, but very few governments have raised their alcohol taxes over time. If anything, we've actually seen countries reducing taxes. But again, the same sort of evidence there. And the sugary beverage taxes are very effective as well in generating new revenues. The other thing that we started to look at was how governments tax these products. So in the past, they used to think a tax was a tax, but then we started to look at the different forms of taxation that governments apply. There are two basic types of taxes that we talk about. One is what we call an ad valorem tax, which is a tax that's levied based on price. So you can think of like a sales tax levied as a percentage of price, versus a specific tax, which is something levied based on quantity. So tax per pack of cigarettes, for example. What we find is that the specific taxes are the ones that are much more effective in terms of both their public health and revenue impact. So this is a picture looking at different types of tax systems for tobacco globally. And what we see is that countries that rely on uniform specific taxes for cigarettes have the highest cigarette prices. As they move towards more and more ad valorem taxes or more complicated systems that tax the same product at different rates based on price or other product characteristics, we see prices going down. The basic idea here is that if you have these ad valorem taxes, it leads to greater variability in prices, more opportunity for consumers to switch to cheaper brands when taxes and prices are going up, and as a result, less of a public health impact and less effective in generating revenues. The other thing we're starting to see when it comes to beverage taxes is some, I think, very interesting experiences in different countries with different types of tax systems. So in the US, we typically tax these products based on volume. But what we've seen is when it comes to alcohol taxes, some countries tax based on ethanol content. And what that's done is to really drive consumers from high alcohol content products to lower and lower alcohol content products. And that's been associated with reductions in some of the consequences of alcohol use. And then when it comes to the sugary beverage taxes, we've seen some interesting experiments happening as different governments have implemented different types of tax systems. In the UK, for example, they have a tiered tax for sugar-sweetened beverages, where they tax high sugar content products at the highest rates, moderate sugar content taxes at a lower rates, and then or products that have very little sugar are taxed at, or are not taxed at all. And what we've seen is that that's not only generated a response on the consumption side, but it's also induced the producers of these products to reformulate their products in a way to get to the lower tax rate. So the high sugar sweetened beverage products have been reformulated in a way that's moved them out of that high tax category to the lower tax category, and we've seen that that's really contributed to significant reductions in sugar consumption as a result. And then on the other side of this, the other part of fiscal policy is thinking about what you do with the revenues that are generated from the taxes. So again, these taxes are very effective in generating revenues. And what we've seen is that when governments put those revenues back into programs that are designed to promote health, you see even bigger positive effects on public health. So in the US, for example, we've done a lot of work looking at how states allocate their tax revenues, other revenues that they get from tobacco. And we've seen that in states where they fund tax or comprehensive tobacco control programs with these tax revenues, we've seen bigger reductions in tobacco use than we would have seen in response to just the tax itself. So we've seen this when it comes to youth smoking prevalence, which is on the picture here. But we've also done the same sort of thing, showing that the same applies when it comes to adult smoking prevalence, overall cigarette sales, things like that. The other part of this is that when governments do allocate these revenues to health purposes, that generates a lot of support for the taxes among the public. So what we see is that people are generally supportive of these taxes, but when the revenues are being earmarked for health purposes, you see even greater support. It's interesting when you start to look at the polling data for tobacco tax increases, for example, even a majority of smokers will support a significant tax increase when they know that some of the revenues from the tax are going back into programs to help smokers quit and to prevent young people from taking up tobacco use. I think probably the best example of this globally is what's happened in the Philippines over the last few years. The Philippines used to have a very complicated tax system for tobacco. They used to have 4 different tax rates applied to different products, partly based on price, partly based on who was producing that products. And they had some products that were taxed at very, very low rates. And what they did with the tax reform in 2012 was to simplify their system and eventually unify their system at a very high tax rate over time, and then continue to increase taxes every year after that with inflation. What they've seen as a result, significant increases in prices, and those increases in prices have driven down cigarette consumption in the Philippines. At the same time, these tax increases have generated significant new revenues. So the green line is showing you the revenues that have come from the tax, despite the reductions in consumption, huge increases in revenues there. And then what they did with the revenues was to earmark them to a universal health care program in the Philippines that has provided significantly greater access to health insurance, health care, particularly among low-income Filipinos. So again, a very effective way of generating revenues, very popular among the population, and something that's been very widely supported. And it's these kind of experiences that have really led to some of the global organizations really promoting the idea of using tobacco taxes in particular as a way of financing their development programs. So this is from the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, talking about the idea that tax revenues from tobacco are a particularly appropriate form of financing developments in developing countries. All right, so we have tremendous evidence, hundreds of studies for tobacco, dozens of studies for alcohol, starting to see a lot of evidence emerging for sugar-sweetened beverage taxes. But when we look around the world at what's happening, we see that most governments aren't using these taxes as effectively as they could. So WHO, for example, recommends that cigarette excise taxes should account for 70% of cigarette prices, or all taxes, including things like sales taxes, should account for 75% of price. And what we see is that very, very few countries have come close to meeting that standard. Taxes on average account for less than half of price. In many countries, we're looking at 20 or 25% of price. If we look at the US, for example, our taxes account for less than 40% of cigarette prices. If we look at alcohol taxes, it's even more surprising. We've seen almost no increases in alcohol taxes globally. And when I started looking at what was happening globally, I was surprised by the fact that many countries don't even tax all alcoholic beverages. You have some countries where they may tax spirits, but they don't tax beer and wine. And a lot of that goes back to some of the production issues in those countries. But surprisingly, very few countries tax, or not very few, but many countries don't tax all alcoholic beverages. And if we look at taxes for alcohol on average, they account for less than 20% of price around the world. On the flip side, we are starting to see more and more interest in sugar-sweetened beverage taxes globally. We've seen a number of countries that have implemented these types of taxes, taxes that are more significant than that tax in Mexico. And we're starting to see these taxes emerge in the US as well at the local level. So we've seen cities like Berkeley and Philadelphia, Cook County for a little while, have implemented these types of sugary beverage taxes. So if we think about why these taxes haven't gone as far as they could have, it really comes back to the industries and their allies that are arguing against these taxes, and they typically use economic arguments when they're trying to discourage governments from implementing or raising these taxes. And the economic arguments tend to fall into 3 basic categories. One is that if you put these taxes into place, if you raise these taxes, you're not going to get the revenues, you're not going to get the public health effect that you're thinking about, because everybody's just going to avoid the taxes. There's going to be a big black market develop in these products. And as a result, it's going to lead to a lot of illicit trade, a lot of tax avoidance and tax evasion. The second argument is that these taxes are going to hit the poor the hardest. They're going to hit working class consumers, the poor, and that they're unfair in some sense. And then the last argument is that it's going to have significant negative economic effects. It's going to lead to job losses in the industries that produce and distribute these products, and that's going to spill over to the broader economy. So if we look at these arguments, I spend a lot of my time now not just showing how effective taxes are, but then also dealing with the arguments that get raised in opposition to them. We see that they're generally going to be very overstated, if not completely false. So I'll start with the tax avoidance and tax evasion issues. This one has a bit of truth to it. There is some tax avoidance, tax evasion that goes on in response to differences in taxes across borders. We see that particularly in the US. But this is a picture from New York City. In New York, they've raised their taxes at the city level, also significant tax increases at the state level, and that's driven up prices on the red line. Despite the fact that about half the cigarettes that are consumed in New York either avoid or evade the tax, we've still seen significant reductions in adult smoking prevalence and even larger reductions in youth smoking prevalence. So even when there is tax avoidance, tax evasion going on, we still see real public health impacts from these tax increases, and we still see real revenues being generated from the tax. This is a picture that comes from Cook County, where I come from, which includes Chicago. We have the highest combined states and local taxes in the country at this point, $6.16 a pack. Smokers could avoid those taxes. All they'd have to do is drive a few miles to Indiana, where taxes are less than $1 a pack. But what we've seen is that even though there is, again, significant tax avoidance, significant tax evasion, as the tax has gone up, it's generated revenues. If we look at what's happening around the world, it actually goes in exactly the opposite direction of what you'd expect if it was taxes that were driving illicit trade. So what we've done here is to look at taxes and prices across the horizontal axis, countries further to the right, higher taxes, higher prices, and then on the vertical axis, looking at the market share for illicit cigarettes. And what we see is it's the countries that have higher taxes and prices that actually have less illicit trade in tobacco, and countries with lower taxes and prices that have more illicit trade. And it really comes down to what I describe as the strength of governance in these countries. How effective their tax administration is, how effectively they control their borders, how free from corruption they are, how aggressively they enforce their tax laws. And when we start to look at these sorts of measures of governance, we see that this really explains the differences in illicit trade across countries. It's not tax and prices driving it, it's these governance issues. So here I'm looking at a measure which is called the Transparency Index, how free from corruption governments are. Countries that are less corrupt are the ones that have strong governance, less problem with illicit trade. Countries that have these governance issues, a lot of corruption, are the ones that have the bigger problems with illicit trade. The last point here is that if governments decide to do something about this, they can really deal with it effectively. So this is a picture that comes from the UK. If you go back to the early 2000s in the UK, illicit cigarettes accounted for somewhere between 25 and 30% of overall cigarette consumption. The UK government decided that it was going to take this on head on. It made it a priority. It strengthened its enforcement efforts, adopted some of the new technologies that were available for tracking products as they move through the distribution chain, and aggressively pursued the big players in this in the illicit trade in the UK. What they're able to do is to then drive down illicit trade to less than 10% of the markets at the same time as they raise their taxes, at the same time as they reduced smoking prevalence, and at the same time as they were generating increased revenues. So again, if you look at this, governments can do something about it if they really put their minds to it. And that's been incorporated. The experiences in the UK, the experiences from other countries around the world have been incorporated into the illicit trade protocol to the WHO's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control that really talks about using some of the better measures that are available for tax administration, using tracking and tracing, using strong fiscal markings, strengthening enforcement efforts, and then really penalizing those who engage in illicit trade. So this is something that's globally really starting to take shape. It finally entered into force last fall, and governments are going to start to implement some of the policies that are being called on there. All right, the second argument has to do with the impact on the poor, the idea that these are regressive taxes. If you raise these taxes, they're going to hurt low-income populations. So several things that I want to talk about here. The first is that, at least when it comes to tobacco, we're starting to develop good evidence that shows that it's not the poor that are consuming these products, it's the consumption of these products that are driving people into poverty. So what we're calling the vicious cycle of tobacco and poverty. So the idea here is that spending on tobacco products diverts household spending on other goods and services, leads to illnesses that are going to cause people to miss time at work, which is going to reduce their incomes, leads to premature death, which has a significant negative effect on family income and can drive households into poverty. So some really nice studies from countries like India and China where we've shown that this relationship exists. The second part of it is that these taxes are regressive taxes. These are taxes that are any consumption tax is going to be a regressive tax. But the idea here is that a tax increase can actually be a progressive policy in the sense that it's going to lead to larger reductions in use among lower income consumers. So basic economic theory, the more you spend of your budget on any product, the more you're going to respond to changes in prices. And we see that really nicely. There was a study done in Turkey a few years ago looking at the implications of tax increases there. And what we're looking at here is showing how much consumption changes in response to tax increases, and then how much people's payment of taxes changes in response to those tax increases. So here we see the biggest reductions in consumption among the lowest income third of the population, so big that that actually reduces how much they're paying in tobacco taxes, and the burden of the tax increase falls onto the higher income consumers who continue to consume. So very progressive in the sense that it's leading to bigger reductions in consumption, bigger improvements in health, and financially progressive in the sense that the burden's falling on higher income consumers. And then over the last few years, the World Bank has started to develop a number of studies in countries around the world looking at the longer term implications of this, looking at what happens to then spending on healthcare over time, what happens to incomes. So going back to what I talked about earlier. So the idea is that you get the biggest reductions in tobacco use in the lowest income populations, and that leads over time to reductions in healthcare spending. Those populations end up healthier, they end up more productive, their incomes go up as a result of that. And what you see is that when you look at the long-term impact, tax increases on tobacco are a very, very progressive policy. And then again, the last part of this relates to how governments spend the revenues that they get from these taxes, and when those revenues go back into programs that specifically target low-income populations, that's going to also offset any adverse financial impact on low-income households. And just again, the Philippines, I think, is the best example of this, where they've used their tax revenues to fund universal health care, particularly expanding access to care for the low-income Filipinos. All right, the last argument is that this is going to have a negative effect on the broader economy. The industries here argue that they employ a lot of people in producing these products, distributing these products, and they count up all the jobs in retailing. And then they argue the incomes that people are making as a result of these jobs get spent on other goods and services. That creates jobs in the broader economy. And that if you raise taxes, if you reduce consumption, that's going to lead to these massive job losses. So they only tell you about part of the story. They don't tell you what happens in response to the changes in consumption and government revenues. So if people stop consuming these products in response to tax and price increases, the money that they spend on those products doesn't just disappear from the economy. People will spend it on other goods and services, and that's going to lead to job gains in other sectors. And then more importantly, the government's going to spend those new tax revenues, and they're going to spend them on things that tend to be very labor intensive. You can think about local law enforcement and schools and healthcare and things like that. And that's going to create jobs that are going to offset any job losses in the tax sectors. So if we look at the evidence on this, we see significant evidence for tobacco, dozens of studies from countries around the world that show that when tobacco use goes down, in response to tax increases or in response to other tobacco control policies, we actually see net increases in employment in most countries as a result of that, or no change in countries where you don't see employment going up. The other part of this is that governments can also do something about this, again, if they use their tax revenues to try to offset any of these transitional costs. So we've seen this happen in countries, again, like Turkey and the Philippines, where they've taken some of their tobacco tax revenues as they've raised taxes and put that back into things like crop diversification programs for farmers, put it back into retraining programs for those employed in manufacturing. And what they've seen, again, is that that's, if anything, even maximize the employment gains that you get from these tax increases. And then when we started to look at what's happened in places like Mexico where they've implemented the sugary beverage tax, we see the same sort of evidence. We see that there's really no impact of this tax on employment in the tax sector here. The companies that produce the sugary drinks are also the same ones that are producing diet drinks and bottled water and things like that. So you see no real impact in the tax sector, and you see no real impact in the economy overall. So again, just to summarize all this, we know that higher taxes on tobacco and alcohol are going to be very effective in reducing tobacco and alcohol use, and the sugary sweetened beverage taxes that we're seeing implemented have a big effect on consumption there as well, and that the reductions in consumption are going to lead to real improvements in health, reductions in NCDs, and economic gains as well. We know that the counter-arguments against these taxes are going to either be completely false or they're going to be greatly overstated, as I've talked about. And that's really led to this idea that taxes, alcohol and tobacco taxes in particular, are considered the best buys in terms of NCD prevention globally. And then just to wrap up, this was something that got the attention of Michael Bloomberg a few years ago, has become a big focus of their global tobacco control efforts, and led Bloomberg to create what's called the Task Force on Fiscal Policy and Health. So this was created just over a year ago, headed up by Larry Summers, former Secretary of the Treasury, former President of the World Bank, President at Harvard. And it involves a lot of heads of state globally, as well as ministers of finance from a number of different countries. And they've just released their findings. It took a while, but just last week they released their report talking about the importance of taxing tobacco, alcohol, and sugary drinks, and looking at some of the estimates of what could be achieved if we were to do this. So it goes back to what Dr. Kern mentioned earlier. We could save millions of lives if governments were really to implement these types of tax policies. So we did some simulation work for them, looking at what would happen if taxes were increased enough to raise prices by 50% for tobacco, alcohol, and sugary drinks. And that would lead to, over the next 50 years, over 50 million premature deaths being averted as a result of the consumption of these products, and at the same time would generate over $21 trillion in revenues over those times. So hugely effective policy when it comes to public health, hugely effective when it comes to generating revenues. So thank you.